Sir, you are live.
Okay, shall we start? Yeah. A very warm good evening to one and all. It's a pleasure and a privilege to be here on behalf of my own self and on behalf of my very, very good friend, Dr. Vinod. I welcome you all to this fourth edition of this COVID that we've been doing in Tamil Nadu. And we understand that we have gone through very, very difficult times. But then, as I said, our will has prevailed. And I think if at least we see the light at the end of the tunnel at this point of time. All of us have gone through through a lot of things, physically, spiritually, economically, socially, and I think it's been a terrible loss for each and every one of us. It's been a terrible, but it's also been a time of introspection. I think that's what really strikes me at the end of it all. You know, um, this really brings about the fact that we need to be concerned, love thy neighbor as thyself, and I think that's really what is being said. And I think this is so important that in times like this we try to help ourselves by not only exchanging knowledge but also exchanging kindness and courtesy and inquiring about people's welfare. I think it just taught us many lessons. Least of it is medical, and I think more of it is humanity based. And I think it's a great opportunity to be here. And we have two very good speakers today, Dr. Yuvraj and Dr. Roy, who will be talking to us on the post-COVID scenario. And we only hope and pray that post-COVID remains post-COVID, does not go backwards, but it goes forwards as far as the post-COVID is concerned. And I think I hand over to Dr. Vinod to say a few words and to introduce Dr. Yuvraj. Dr. Vinod, please.
Thank you, sir. Thank you. Very, very interesting starting, sir. Thank you. And I think Yuvraj needs no introduction. Yuvraj has been with us for a very long time. Most of us in every forum, we invite him as a speaker and everyone knows him. He's the head of pulmonary medicine in Venkateshwara Medical College in Pondicherry. Very, very dynamic person, a great teacher. And I am looking forward to hearing you. I won't stand in your way. Yuvraj, I hand over to you for the presidency.
Sir, thanks for a nice introduction, sir. It's like, many meetings like we just discussed. It was a very great pleasure that, we have both of you in the forum so that, at the end of the discussion, we can have some fruitful, sharing of our knowledge and thoughts. Since you got more exposure to COVID cases, so maybe you are the right person so that you can tell you the exact rulings. Okay, thank you, sir. So without wasting much of time, I'll go to the topic. Sir, can you see the slide, sir?
Yeah, you make it full page.
Yes,
I think you need to go to, that's it, fine.
Yes,
You're
sir.
good to go. Yeah.
Yes. Okay. So the topic that was given to me is a post-COVID lung sequelae. I think most of us are facing this in day-to-day practice. In Pondicherry also, we got a peak of COVID cases during the time of pandemic, and now it is far reduced, and we are expecting second peak. I think it should not be there, as sir was telling. Even this post-COVID also is not a very easy task, or it's not a simple issue for most of the pulmonologists, because the COVID has caused so much of damage to the lung, particularly not for all the cases. Only those patients who got a severe and critical illness, their lung got so much of injury because of COVID. Not directly because of COVID, it's because of forced inflammatory response that everybody knows that fact. And we are afraid that it will create a big issue, because the quantum of cases that we got for severe COVID and also critical patients, since it's a pandemic involved a huge population like India. So maybe in the next few months, or in this month also, we are facing a lot of challenges. So as we know that COVID is not a disease that is restricted to lung, it can cause terrible damage to most of the organs. You could see here, it can damage the olfactory receptor, olfactory bulb, that can lead to anosmia, and it can also cause encephalitis. It can injure the lung. It can just damage the alveoli. It can lead to ARDS and lung, and pulmonary fibrosis and other complications. It can cause damage to the liver. It can cause acute kidney injury and all the things like so. As we can't tell that the COVID involves only lung. So basically, the COVID pneumonia, those patients who got a severe disease and those patients who got a critical illness, definitely all the organs would have been touched by the COVID, and definitely that will create a sequelae in most of the patients. So the patients at high risk of COVID-19 pneumonia, which group of patients are that we are expecting complications? All patients who are managed in intensive care unit or high dependency unit, indirectly, if they had a severe pneumonia or critically ill pneumonia, all patients discharged with a new oxygen prescription, all patients with protracted dependency on high flow of oxygen, high inspired fraction of oxygen, or all the patients who got a long duration of CPAP or BiPAP during the time of in the ICU, or any other patient, the discharging team has significant concerns about it. So all these patients, we can expect some form of pulmonary sequelae after COVID pneumonia. So before discussing the theory and facts, let me just show you how bad is COVID pneumonia in the post-COVID sequelae. What are the different COVID post-COVID sequelae that we faced in the past 2 months? So this is a 58-year-old gentleman who came with the complaints of breathlessness for the past 3 days, which was progressive, grade 3 to grade 4 MMRC. He was having dry cough for the past 3 days. There's no history of orthopnea or PND, no history of diurnal variation or postural variation, no history of fever, myalgia, or sore throat. So when we probed the history, he got a COVID pneumonia 2 months back, for which he got treated with supportive medications from a nearby government hospital. He was a known diabetic for the past 5 years on regular medication with good control. He was a known smoker with 30 pack years, farmer by occupation, not a known case of CAD or CKD or PTB. On examination at the time of presentation, his SpO2 was around 60% only in room air, 90% with 15 liters of oxygen face mask. Heart rate was around 134 and BP was around 900/70. On examination, he was literally tachypneic, using all the accessory muscles of respiration. The breath sounds were reduced in right hemithorax and expiratory wheeze in the left hemithorax. So this was the CT that was taken at the time of discharge from the previous hospital. So you could see that this patient was, literally a normal patient. Maybe he got a COPD. He has not got a good treatment with any other pulmonologist, but he got only oral medication as per the history. So when we saw the CT, we could see there are a lot of, bullous disease, bullous changes was there. There is actually, there are interlobular septal thickening is there. There are residual, some airspace opacity consolidation is there. You could see the traction bronchiectasis, all these things. And as you see that almost like 80-90% of lung is involved. So what we expect is the resting hypoxemia, which is not, a surprise for us. And we admitted the case and we managed symptomatically. We gave a treatment for, COPD at the same time with oxygen support, with CPAP, intermittent CPAP, and with oxygen. And also we started antifibrotic therapy with the pirfenidone. So this patient, we did a CT after 2 weeks because we got a doubt that this patient had a progressive disease from the time of discharge. So you could see the CT in another 20 days. This was CT another 20 days, just to show you how severe is the disease. Maybe this patient might have had a bad small airway disease in the form of COPD, which was not properly treated by previous physicians, or which was not properly treated because he would not have gone to a good physician. So you could see the same areas wherever you could see that there is increase in the evidence of fibrosis, both interstitial thickening and septal changes were there. You could see that whole of the lung is replaced by multiple, emphysematous bulla. You could see that the bullas was there, bulla. And here also you could see the increase in size of bulla, whatever we saw in the last CT. So we confirmed with the other cuts also whether it is a pneumo or not. So it's not a pneumo, it's only a lung with the large bullous changes are there. You could see the progression of the fibrosis. You could see the progression of small airway disease in a matter of 20 days. So that severe is the post-COVID sequelae that we should understand. This is once again a case number 2, a 50-year-old COVID positive female who was admitted with the complaints of fever for 5 days, breathlessness for 3 days, and dry cough for 3 days. On admission, the vitals were stable with the SpO2 of 98% room air. On day 2 of admission, her saturation started dropping and was put on supplemental oxygen, only just 2 to 5 liters by face mask. On day 4, she started deteriorating further with increase in demand of oxygen. Then she was put on NRBM. On day 9, the patient was put up on HFNO due to worsening hyper. This is the typical scenario in a worsening COVID pneumonia you see in the ICU. And day 11, she was put up on support with a positive pressure ventilation with NIV and CPAP, as she could not tolerate HFNO because she required the pressure to withstand her respiratory distress. In addition to the above measures, she was also given other form of standard therapies like remdesivir. She got a hypoxemia with severe COVID pneumonia, steroids, LMDBH, and antibiotics. On day 18, the patient was improved, and hence we end up from NIV and was maintaining oxygen maintaining saturation, which is only 6 liters of oxygen with face mask. Once again on day 23, so she was RT-PCR was repeated, which was negative for COVID, and CT was taken at the time of on day 23. So you could see the COVID has caused a severe pneumonia, and now you could see almost 80% of lung is involved. There is residual airspace opacity along with the septal thickening and septal changes are there. That severe is the COVID pneumonia that we have to see. And this is once again a case of COPD. Why I just shown, because it can cause any amount of damage to lung. This is one of the typical case that where this COVID can also present as a cavitary disease. You could see that this is a post-COVID patient only. It's a COPD. It's a known case of COPD under treatment with me with a standard protocol therapy. You could see a large bulla, emphysematous bulla is there in the left lung, and also you could see the residual, airspace opacity here. I'll show you that cavitation that is in the periphery, which is not very typical that you see here. Like you see here, this area and this area, the cavitation was there, which is not very typical that what we see as a sequelae in most of the patients with the COVID. And that cavity persisted, and I've just taken a repeat CT also, it was there. So just to show you the varied presentation. And this is once again a case number 4. It was literally a normal individual with no comorbidities. Is active male with a COVID positive status 1 month back. He came to hospital with complaints of sudden onset of breathlessness for 4 days with a cough for 2 days. When we took the X-ray, we were just shocked that he got a good amount of pneumothorax was there, and ICD was inserted. And this is once again a case of post-COVID induced pneumothorax. And case by last but not least, you could see this patient is a 63-year-old male who is a known diabetic on insulin. He came with chief complaints of exertional dyspnea for the past 1 week, cough with scanty sputum for the past 5 days. There is no history of orthopnea or PND or reduced urine output. The patient was diagnosed to have COVID pneumonia 45 days back, admitted in a private hospital, treated according to the standard protocols. At the time of discharge, patient was stable. There is no requirement of oxygen at the time of discharge. But after 45 days, he developed dyspnea for 1 week and cough with sputum production. These were the X-ray at the time of discharge. So what we thought is there are only 2 diseases. One is secondary bacterial suppression, bacterial pneumonia.
I muted him. Yeah.
And also we thought of, as the patient was having resting tachycardia, we thought of pulmonary embolism. We confirmed the segmental arteries pulmonary embolism. So this is once again a sequelae. You could see the post-COVID pulmonary embolism along with the bacterial pneumonia and sputum culture and blood culture, which was showed heavy growth of pseudomonas. We treated and just he recovered from the pneumonia and embolism and discharge. So what is this? Actually, this the most common sequelae after a post-COVID, what we see in a severe pneumonia is a fibrosis. The fibrosis could be viewed because of a disordered wound healing process and may be directly related to the severity of inciting event. The various mechanisms of lung injury in COVID-19 has been described, with both viral and immune mechanisms has been implicated. The additional factors could predispose the individual to severe injury also is there, and that leads to the increased risk of morbidity and mortality in this group of patients. This is a very good study that was from the pooled analysis from the 3 centers in Austria, where they analyzed the respiratory function, that is a pulmonary function, 6 and 12 weeks after discharge in a patient who got a COVID pneumonia. The CT scan at 6 weeks showed a lung damage from inflammation, shown in the form of ground glass opacitation in 88% of patients. At 12 weeks also, this measure dropped to 56%. The severity of overall lung damage dropped from 8 points from 6-week CT scan to 4 points on 12-week CT scan. You could see the decrement in the lung function, that is FEV1, measured at 6 weeks of all these recovered patients at around 23% improvement was there. It was less than 23% showed less than 80% of normal value. And when we did the same, when they did the same FEV1 at 12 weeks, it was around 21% who got a FEV1 less than 80%. Same thing with FEC also, 28% of the individuals got less than 80% and 19% who got a after 12 weeks who got a less than 80% value. So what does it show is that, so those patients who got a severe lung involvement, so these patients have some form of restriction, some form of reduced vital capacity, and that will improve over the course of time. And that is not for sure for all the patients, that to be noted. And what is the pathogenesis of pulmonary fibrosis? As you see in any fibrotic interstitial lung disease, an initial phase of lung injury is followed by acute inflammation as well as an attempt to repair. This is a disordered attempt to repair. That's why you get an enormous deposition of fibroblastic tissue in the lung and also in the interstitium. In severe and persistent injury with damage to the base membrane, the fibroblastic activities persist, which is converting, organizing into fixed and progressive fibroblastic tissue. The formation of this scar tissue, either it is a focal or diffuse in the lung, results in the disorganized alveolar architecture, which results in the excessive deposition of extracellular matrix. This will manifest as an increase in the irregular septal thickening, increases the interlobular and intralobular septal thickening, along with the reticular pattern with traction bronchitis in the CT scan. So alveolar macrophages may play a major role. It phagocytes alveolar debris and it leads to the synthesis of cytokines and growth factors, which is involved in the normal repair after a tissue injury. In severe and persistent injury with damage to the base membrane, there will be a progressive fibroblastic response, as I already mentioned. The formation of scar tissue, once again, is a focal or diffuse, as I told in the last slide. This is a schematic representation. You could see any acute or chronic inflammation due to any damage. For example, here it is because of viral injury. There is a damage to alveolar epithelial cells, which leads to the overexpression of all the pro-inflammatory cytokines, that is TGF beta, TNF alpha, interleukin 6. TGF beta is a pro-fibrosis, as everybody knows this. And this leads to the increase in the activation of fibroblast. This fibroblast will be converted into myofibroblast. The myofibroblast have actin in it, so it has a contractive response. So this leads to the large irregular deposition of the collagen, and it leads to the irregular fibrosis. That is the sequelae that you see in most of the patients, the severe COVID pneumonia. This is a histopathological representation of variety of damage that is caused after a COVID. Here you could see alveoli along with the hyaline membrane. You could see here is a thrombus, microthrombi. That is another complication that you expect in a patient with a severe COVID pneumonia. Here you could see the early proliferative response along the bronchioles, along the alveoli. Here it is the intermediate, and this is the late proliferative response. What does it show is that in patients with severe and very severe forms of COVID pneumonia, there is a disordered wound healing, disordered tissue healing is there. This leads to the excessive deposition of fibroblast. This leads to the excessive activation of fibroblast, which leads to the more fibrogenic process that, as you see in other fibrotic interstitial lung disease, that itself lead to a increase in the extracellular matrix deposition, increased collagen deposition, that leads to the fibrosis. So why this COVID ARDS is different from typical ARDS? As we know that ARDS seems to be the main cause of pulmonary fibrosis in most of the patients with severe COVID-19 pneumonia. ARDS caused by SARS-CoV-2 is slightly different from typical ARDS. This everybody knows this because the subset of patients will have usually a normal complaints or high complaints. What we expect in ARDS, it is actually an injured lung. You expect a very low complaints. It will be very difficult to ventilate that lung, but this patient have a normal or high complaints. That's why there is always a conflict that what type of PEEP strategy that we need to follow the patient with COVID pneumonia while you manage this patient in ICU. But this always depends upon the person who actually managing the case. After seeing their complaints only, we can decide on how much PEEP we have to apply, because that is also very important, because pressure also we need to check. And onset of COVID-19 ARDS was between 8 to 12 days, rendering that 1 week onset is limit is totally inadequate in COVID pneumonia. And CT findings, of course, is totally somewhat different between a typical ARDS and COVID, because COVID, most of the cases you see, most of the time you'll see a peripheral consolidation. It starts as a peripheral consolidation. That's very different from the typical ARDS. So what are the risk factors for pulmonary fibrosis following a SARS-CoV-2? As I already discussed that not all the patients will develop pulmonary fibrosis, because we have seen a lot of cases of severe COVID pneumonia, but not all the cases will come with a severe fibrosis. Not all the cases will come with a resting hypoxemia. Which group of patients are having high risk? So based on the previous experience with other coronavirus like SARS and MERS, we got a huge epidemic with SARS and MERS that taught us a huge lessons. And the patients, they followed up with SARS and MERS. The follow-up study was with SARS, almost like after 2 years they did a study, and after 15 years they followed with all the patients with pulmonary functions. What they saw is that there are some patients who got a severe disease, they got a restrictive form of pattern at the end of 2 years. But at the end of 15 years, when they see that the same patients, definitely there is an improvement in the restriction, and there is an improvement in the lung function that was seen in the SARS. Whereas MERS, almost like literally 20 to 30% of people got only 2-year, 3-year follow-up study is there. 20 to 30% of people who got a severe pneumonia, they got a residual lung disease, they got a residual fibrosis that gets converted into a restrictive form of disease, which is somewhat permanent and it is not improving in the course of time. That was the previous experience with the previous studies. Indirectly, what I'm just trying to tell is that so advanced age with a severe COVID pneumonia, these patients are having a more risk of pulmonary fibrosis when compared to the patients less than 40 years. Why I'm telling? Because this may be due to the fact that there is an immune senescence. Because IPF is more common in the advanced age group, there may be a more fibroblastic response, there may be more fibrogenic response in the old age when compared to younger age group. So this might be the reason that advanced age is risk factor for pulmonary fibrosis after a severe COVID pneumonia. So based on the illness severity also, we can decide on this patient will go for fibrosis. As I already told you, only few patients will go for severe COVID pneumonia and only very few of them will go for critical ill disease. So these two group of patients only will go for fibrosis. As you know that lung involvement and alveolar involvement is more severe in this group of patients. Naturally, the disease will be post sequelae will be very severe in this group of patients. Indirectly, laboratory findings like lymphopenia, leukocytosis, elevated LDH at the time of admission of this patient indirectly correlates to the severity. Some studies have shown that serum LDH measured at the time of admission is a marker of disease severity. It indirectly shows that an indicator of enormous amount of pulmonary tissue destruction and correlates with the risk of mortality in some studies. There is also one more paper that based on the level of D-dimer at the time of admission also, we can predict this patient will go for a reduced DLCO after 3 months. So those patients who got a 10-fold to a 12-fold elevation of a DLCO, elevation of D-dimer, these patients actually will go for a prolonged reduced DLCO when you do actual follow-up in this group of patients. So that's why illness severity also another factor. And length of ICU stay also. Those patients, obviously, you got a severe pneumonia, they stay in the ICU for long duration. Indirectly, whatever strategy, what we use in our treatment, like using a CPAP, using a BiPAP also, using CPAP, BiPAP, additionally forces the lung to more amount of injury. And moreover, using, ventilator strategy also, if you are not using a adequate or good ventilator strategy as per the ARDS net protocol, you are just making the lung more prone for injury, and that can also worsen the fibrosis. That we need to take care of that. And smoking is one of the important risk factors. As you know that smoking, active smokers are at increased risk of all the chronic diseases. COVID pneumonia also is, there will be increased severity of COVID pneumonia is seen in retrospectively seen in active smokers. So in other words, smoking is indirectly linked to the risk of fibrosis in this group of patients. And chronic alcoholism also, as you know that alcohol abuse is responsible for the recurrent aspiration. As you know that there is one theory for idiopathic pulmonary fibrosis also, there is some papers on that. Usually it follows a micro aspiration after the gastric acid. So that leads to that's why idiopathic pulmonary fibrosis starts from the posterior aspect of the lung. So there are some theories are there, which was not hugely accepted. The same way the chronic alcoholism, these patients will have a aspiration, repeated amount of aspiration that will go to the lung, and they have a pro-inflammatory status in their lung tissue. So that will lead to the increased amount of fibrosis when they got a good insult with the viral pneumonia. And what are the strategies for reducing the risk of SARS-CoV-2 associated lung fibrosis? The first and foremost thing is that considering the challenges of treating pulmonary fibrosis, there should be a great focus on strategies aimed at reducing the risk of risk among the COVID-19 patient. The strategy should be you should put a stop to the inflammation. You should put a stop to the viral proliferation. You should put a stop to the fibro proliferation. All these three checks has to be done to prevent the devastating pulmonary fibrosis in this group of patients. So these are the follow-up strategy. I think Sir will deal all this follow-up strategy. How do you manage this pulmonary fibrosis? So treatment of pulmonary fibrosis, as far as you know, there is not even a single drug which was approved by FDA or any international agency for the treatment of post-COVID fibrosis. But we don't have any other drug in our hand. As we know that most of the fibrotic ILDs, we are using nintedanib, pirfenidone. Previously, these drugs were used only for IPF. That was approved by FDA only for IPF. But recently, based on the various trials, we are using for scleroderma-related fibrosing ILDs and other fibrosing ILDs also. The nintedanib and pirfenidone shows a promising response, and nintedanib, a lot of good trials was there, even in non-IPF cases. So that's why nintedanib, there are some case reports are there where it shows a good efficacy. And we have a personal experience also with nintedanib that nintedanib and pirfenidone can be opted for those patients discharge. So you can ask one question: so what is the ideal time for starting an antifibrotic therapy? Based on the previous experience, the fibrosis starts even after 1 week also. So after 1 week, if you see, almost like 4 to 6% got fibrosis. After 2 weeks, 24% of the people got fibrosis. After 3 weeks, almost 40 to 60% got fibrosis. This is based on a small study that was done only for the severe COVID pneumonia. So based on the experience, the fibrosis starts with 1 week, and at 3 weeks it reached the maximum. So it's always better to start at the early phase also. And as you know that these two drugs has good amount of involvement in reducing acute exacerbation ILD. So the concept is that these two drugs also put a check to the inflammation also. That's why there is no harm in giving this drug in early phase of the those patients got a severe COVID pneumonia, because this puts a check on inflammation also. This puts a check on reducing the inflammatory mediators. This puts a check on reducing the fibrogenic response. And last but not least is a lung transplantation. It is only a treatment option in those patients who got a such a bad disease, not recoverable, and that selected patient, you can give a lung transplantation. And these are the different options that you can try for pulmonary fibrosis based on the papers. The first thing is that what they are telling is that you can put a check for viral proliferation, but I won't agree with this statement, because viral proliferation is not correlating with the the load of viral load doesn't correlate with the disease severity. So that's why like whether you give antiviral drug or not, it is not going to make a good sense. Maybe the second week, that is the host inflammatory response. It is the response by the host which can just change all the scenario. So that you have to check. That we are just doing with the steroids. But as you know that steroids show a very good response and anti-inflammatory response in many other studies. But there are certain studies which are against using steroids. That you should note that. And we should always put a check for cytokines also. There are certain studies for cytokines, interleukin 1, interleukin 6. So we have used a couple of patients tocilizumab, where we confirm cytokine storm syndrome. So all this check has to be done to contain the inflammation. Once you contain the inflammation, you can just reduce the damage to the lung. You can reduce the fibroblastic response to the lung. And there are some studies for spironolactone. There are some studies for other traditional medicines also, but none of them are approved. So as far as our experience is concerned, these two drugs are very good, nintedanib and pirfenidone. But what is the problem with this drug is that it is not approved till now. Most of the drugs are on the trial. So you are not authorized to use this drug safely, only trial and error basis. And second thing is that both the drugs are somewhat hepatotoxic, because we are using other drugs, favipiravir and other drugs, antiviral, other drugs also. So when you use for the acute phase, so you should be very careful for this. And most important thing, nintedanib can cause some amount of bleeding complications also, that you need to take care before giving these drugs. So what is my view is that the nintedanib has been shown a good response in reducing acute exacerbation of fibrotic ILD, in reducing acute exacerbation of IPF also. So that's why these two drugs has a good amount of anti-inflammatory action. So when you are starting antifibrotic therapy, it has to be started early. It has to be started, according to me, maybe in a matter of 10 to 14 days. Okay, so 3 to 4 weeks also very well and good, but it reduces the amount of fibrosis that you can do follow. And smoking cessation, and you should advise they should take, if the patient is having chronic respiratory disease, they should take the regular therapy also. And also smoking cessation, they should follow, they should not smoke, and they should not get exposed to organic and inorganic dust. These are the key messages from my presentation. The risk factors for severe COVID-19 are shared with IPF, suggesting that this group of patients will be at increased risk of severe COVID-19. The burden of fibrotic lung disease following SARS-CoV-2 infection is likely to be high. When you just see the scale of pandemic, the global burden of fibrotic lung disease will probably increase considerably when you actually do a study on this. There is a therapeutic rationale for the use of licensed antifibrotic therapy in acute asthma IPF, including those triggered by viral infection also, because they share the common pathway. We don't know that whether it is progressive or not, but it is worthwhile to reduce the fibrosis by using these antifibrotic drugs. The available antifibrotic therapy have broad antifibrotic activity regardless of etiology, and these drugs might have a role in attenuating the profibrotic pathways even in SARS-CoV infection also. That's it from my end. Thank you, sir.
Am I audible?
Yes, sir.
Yeah.
Yes, sir.
Thank you very much, Dr. Yuvraj. That was a wonderful presentation of a person who has lived in the midst of COVID. And I think you've come out with some very startling X-rays, which probably will keep us awake for many days. But then I think the light at the end of the tunnel, as I said, has been the fact that we have not lost these people. These people have terrible X-rays, and still you've been able to salvage them. I think it's a great compliment, not only to you, but I think to the nature of the disease itself. It really appears as though symptoms, laboratory investigations, and radiology doesn't seem to have a very direct inhibition, direct association with the outcomes. And I think this is really, there's a huge diversity between these two things. And I think it is this diversity that we've not been able to really, that's been the challenging thing for us, that we've not been able to mix these two things in one hand and glove. And it's always been also the fact that we don't have any direct access to the virus. Our access to the virus is all roundabout, is all speculative, is compassionate, whatever. And I think wonderful presentation, Dr. Yuvraj. Thank you so much. And it's my great pleasure to introduce my very good friend, Dr. Sena Roy, been with us for a very, very long time. It's been a huge pleasure and a privilege. He's a senior consultant at the railway hospitals and also has had special training in lung transplant. And I think he will come under fire for lung transplant today for sure in Toronto, in Canada. And I think it's my immense pleasure to invite Dr. Sena Roy to talk to us about general post-COVID management. I think this is so important for us because our patients are going to keep coming back to us. What will they come back to us with? Will they come back to us with very poor lung functions? Will they come back to us with other things? Will they be more prone for respiratory infections? Will they be more prone for any other types of pneumonias? What will happen to our COPDs who have gone through this? So I think the post-COVID scenario is a very mixed bag at this point of time. We are not sure not only of what is going to happen, but also what will happen. And I think I will hand over to Dr. Sena Roy to try and enlighten us on that. Dr. Roy, the stage is yours.
Thank you very much, sir. And that's a very glowing introduction from me. Thanks again. My previous speaker, Dr. Yuvraj, was excellent, and he talked about the lung involvement a lot. So I will talk about how should be the follow-up algorithm more. And whatever is I'm talking is based, 90% is based on a BTS guideline, British Thoracic Society guideline. So the issue is here that it's a very unique and novel infection that has already demonstrated a very wide range of perplexing clinical syndromes. Its legacy will be felt long after even the pandemic has passed. It is vital. One of our good friend has explained that a tsunami is going to come about lung involvement, which is possibly true. It's vital that we as a respiratory physicians are primed to detect and manage the long-term consequences of this infection and has sufficient resources to deliver it. Okay. And so the majority of the patients infected with the COVID are discharged from hospital with a persisting radiological changes of the parenchyma. But by the 12th week, approximately 2/3 of the patients have full X-ray resolution. The optimal time of follow-up image to assess the radiological clearance in COVID-19 is unknown. But the current BTS guideline recommends a repeat chest X-ray 6 weeks after a bacterial or viral cap. But again here, the rationale, what is the rationale for that? The rationale being to exclude any primary bronchial neoplasm that can contribute to this lower or subsegmental or segmental pneumonia. However, if you talk about ATS, American Thoracic Society does not suggest a follow-up chest X-ray in a cap. And also, if you take into account the pandemic situation and the COVID pneumonia pattern is not exactly something to hide mass underlying. So perhaps it's not necessary at 6 weeks, but in some cases we might need to do that. So now, unlike the MERS and SARS, acute COVID-19 infection is associated with a high prevalence of VTE and in-situ thrombosis. This is again very unique thing about COVID. Not only the lung parenchyma, this vascular thing is a big problem for us. Patient remain hypercoagulable, and you know that vitreous triad of stasis, damage to the vascular endothelium, and this hypercoagulability are the three triads. So out of that, this hypercoagulability is the problem for a variable period of time, and the prolonged infertility in most of the severely affected patients represents an additional VTE risk factor. It's being increasingly appreciated that the number of patients are being diagnosed with acute PE and deep vein thrombosis de novo during the recovery phase, not only during the treatment phase, but during this recovery phase also. So how do you go about it? Who are more prone to have this kind of DVT or PE, acute PE? As you all know, the conditions are mostly a previous DVT or a thromboembolism of PE, or with genetic predisposition, family history, obesity, prolonged immobilization, associated connective tissue disorders is very important. Obese patient with a previous SLE, I will be very, very skeptic to start maybe some kind of a VT prophylaxis drug and continue that for prolonged period. So how long to continue? That there is also a problem in that. The duration here is the British guidelines suggest 1 month is good enough, but whereas there are many mixed suggestions that maybe perhaps continue for the 3 months also. So other things which can make you more susceptible to VTEs are recent surgery, increasing age more than 75 years, hormone therapy, catheter in the central lines, varicose vein, and obviously the sepsis. So these are the patients you should be more considering that PE either during the treatment period or in the post-COVID recovery period can happen for this patient, and be very much focusing on that. The post-PE complications happens if there is an acute PE or chronic thromboembolic disease and the pulmonary hypertension, obviously. So what are the specific aims of post-COVID-19 pneumonia follow-up? There will be that the aim is to follow up to ensure that the patients are followed up in a timely but a practical manner, so that you are going to identify early the respiratory complications and the vascular complications, but also not to exaggerate the normal patients, also not to over treat or over investigate the patients who are going to get okay by its own. So that should be the idea. And this has to be taken into account the disease severity, the likelihood of long-term respiratory sequelae, and the functional disability. So with that point in mind, the early, medium, and long-term respiratory complications of the COVID pneumonia is the specific aim. The most serious and potentially life-threatening complications, such as pulmonary fibrosis and the vascular disease identification at the earlier stage. Also, the patient's need, such as breathlessness, oxygen requirement, assessment of the oxygen need at home, rehabilitation, palliative care. Rehabilitation is a very important item, but perhaps we always lack in that. We do not focus much here in India about rehabilitation. Then the palliative care, symptom management, and psychosocial management are also very important for us to consider. Then other than the respiratory thing, we have to find out the cardiac and nephrological conditions, which are also a potential threat for the COVID-19 post-COVID period to get prolonged. And at all these patients of the patient contacts, you should have a holistic view, so that not only the lung, we will be talking of all the other than the respiratory system, all the other systems also. So how do you discharge at the beginning? On discharge from the patient, all patients should be advised that if they develop a progressive or a new respiratory or a cardiac symptoms, to attend a hospital or their local GP. I usually write in my all discharge patients this following lines: if the SpO2 is 94 or below, breathing difficulty, chest pain, palpitation, severe weakness, high-grade fever, persistent cough, or a new cough which was not there previously, to come back and follow up in the hospital again. So this should cover all this post-COVID problem or the acute problem also, which can happen. These are the follow-up algorithm. This is taken from the BTS. For this, they have divided into two. One in the severe disease, like those patients who are cared in the ICU or HDU or in severe pneumonia, but they have not been kept in ICU or HDU, but kept in the ward. So that is one group, and the other is a non-severe group. So how do you go about that? Those patients are the severe disease patients. They should be reviewed once after 4 weeks or 6 weeks of the discharge. Either that should be a teleconsultation or a face-to-face consultation. And you have to consider what are the possibilities of who are those patients who are going to be having a chance of having complications. So those patients, as Dr. Juvaraj has already told you, again to repeat, all patients who are on intensive care unit, HDU, or the patient discharged with a new oxygen prescription on discharge, and the patient who were on high fraction oxygen, on CPAP or BiPAP or on a ventilator, or anybody else whom you think has a significant concern. I will be having a concern with an obese patient or a post cardiac disease patient with more than 70 years of old patients. Those patients are male. I'll be having much more concern to see quickly after 4 to 6 weeks. So these are the people whom we are going to have a look. If they are good, at that time you ask them to come back after 12 weeks after discharge, and then you do a chest X-ray. And with the chest X-ray, you will you will compare it with the previous chest X-rays and see whether there should be 3 scenarios. Either the chest X-ray has resolved and the patient has also improved symptomatically, very well and good. So this patient does not need any further follow-up, discharge them. The second scenario is the patient has clinically improved, but the chest X-ray is not much improved. It is still maybe evolving. It is still undergoing changes. In those cases, as the patient is clinically improving, so in those cases also we are somewhat less vigilant. We can ask them to come back after another 4 to 6 weeks to do a repeat chest X-ray and come back and review with us. The third group of patients, for whom they are still remaining somewhat symptomatic and their chest X-ray has not at all improved. In those kind of patients, assess full, do a chest sputum sampling, do a echocardiography, rule out PE, and do a complete full pulmonary function testing. And if there is abnormality in this physiological impairment, along with an abnormal chest X-ray, with an evidence of pulmonary venous disease, pulmonary vascular disease, do a HRCT, no contrast HRCT, and CTP to rule out the interstitial lung diseases and the pulmonary vascular diseases. If they are there, obviously you should focus on it and consider treatment. So the perplexing issues of post-COVID conditions. One, there is always a debate is whether this post-COVID, the COVID ARDS is a phenotypically distinct form or it is same as the conventional ARDS. Dr. Juvaraj perhaps thinks that it is completely distinct as because there is profound hypoxemia, there is relatively preserved lung compliance, which he talked about, and obviously there is significant reclamation. But there are many people, and I perhaps think also in the same line that there is no different ARDS. This is all the same ARDS, perhaps here and there some minimal changes. Then there is a clearly emerging signal is coming out for the endothelial dysfunction with a high prevalence of pulmonary vascular disturbances. This we must understand that not only the pulmonary parenchymal problem, there is a pulmonary vascular dysfunction is there, thrombotic disease with PE and acute pulmonary hypertension in the most severely affected patients. What are the causes for this? The inflammation, DIC, hypoxemia, the severe hypoxemia is the most commonest cause of the pulmonary hypertension. And this immobility also does not help. All these predispose to development of this thromboembolic disease and the complications. Some patients, because of PE, in the acute phase will be initiated, or the pulmonary hypertension will be initiated on the pulmonary vasodilators during the acute illness and will be discharged on those therapies. These patients will require a dedicated pulmonary hypertension follow-up. Patients with cough features. This is the question again. When we should consider starting antifibrotic drug? Should we continue to treat with steroids or start, as Dr. Juvraj said, we start antifibrotic drugs early? Well, he feels and believes that we must start antifibrotic drugs early. I again try to contradict him. Obviously, this is a new field. We are all learning. But nobody is correct, perhaps. We really don't know who is correct. But our thinking, or my kind of thinking, is that those, how come pulmonary fibrosis can be so acute and condition? You can think of pulmonary fibrosis only when there are some kind of traction bronchiectasis happening, some kind of honeycombing happening. Then only you can think of pulmonary fibrosis. Why to give antifibrotic drugs at so early stage? They are only cough, steroids. Low dose steroids after discharge also perhaps will be good enough to take care of those cough features. Oral steroids. Now, how long to give oral steroids and when to stop, when to start, treat it as really pulmonary fibrosis and give antifibrotic drugs? Perhaps I believe in that group of people who thinks maybe 1 to 2 months is a good time to wait for starting the antifibrotic drugs. That's okay and fine with me. So maybe a 1 month is I can think of. And if the CT finding suggests to me that there is a traction bronchiectasis and there is the pulmonary honeycombing are happening, that is definitely sign of pulmonary fibrosis, which will never go with steroids. So then maybe perhaps I will start antibiotics. We can have a good discussion for and against for all those things. So these patients also need to be assessed with the specialist ILD teams. Again, if you are thinking of that there is a PE or complication of that, so how do you go about that? Why we are talking of that? It has been found in a study that non-COVID-19 ARDS patients, the thrombotic complications are 2.6 times and PE is 6.2 times more likely than the same kind of ARDS in a non-COVID and COVID. So if you are having a PE chance of 6.2 times more than a non-COVID ARDS, I would perhaps be very much willing to start and continue those either drugs which will take care of those VTs. So which drugs you should be thinking of? What should be your choice of drug on those tests? Obviously, the newer oral anticoagulants are okay, but remain again, you have to keep in mind that they are not more effective than the previous drugs of acetrom or warfarin. They only are somewhat less bordering, less side effects are less. So maybe a younger patients, I will be happy to start also with acetrom warfarin. You just have to see that INR only. Whereas a person who is 75 years or older people, I would perhaps try to start them on a newer oral anticoagulants. Also, you have to keep in mind that pregnancy, breastfeeding people, and people who are having a mechanical heart valve, they may not be a good candidate for the newer oral anticoagulants. So the post-COVID, how do you have a holistic view? The holistic assessment will be not only the lung fibrosis, but also you should assess and manage the breathlessness. You should also consider the management of the dysfunctional breathing. There should be symptoms or management or palliative care management where required. There should be assessment and management of the oxygen requirement, consideration of the rehabilitation need, and referral for rehabilitation, psychosocial assessment, and assessment for anxiety, fatigue, post-viral cough, very important, other than the venous thromboembolic disease, which we spoke a lot of, and obviously the post-intensive care unit complications such as sarcopenia, cognitive impairment, post-traumatic stress disorders. These are very important now after this prolonged intensive care unit stay and without seeing their relative. These are very important now currently. You have to take help of the intensive care doctors because there will be tracheostomy also for a few patients and you have to manage them. So like that. So that's a holistic attitude. So this we have already discussed. What next is the mild to moderate disease. In this mild to moderate disease, again, the safety net of 12 weeks after discharge is always there. You would perhaps say this patient was cared for only in the emergency or in the ward for a few days and or maybe kept in the home. Why do you want to see the patient again after 12 weeks? Just because of this safety net of whether this patient is having an acute VT manifestation again or the lung fibrosis, which perhaps was not there when you have seen him at the beginning. So that's why the 12 weeks after discharge, do a chest X-ray and the same kind of follow-up as in the previous case. Here there is no earlier follow-up is required. So PE and post-PE follow-up will be patient diagnosed with PE during the acute illness should have this follow-up to find out if the pH is happening, pulmonary hypertension, or there is significant chronic thromboembolic disease is happening. If there is no evidence of chronic thromboembolism, pH or significant residual thromboembolism, and as we know that this is a strongly provoked nature of the acute COVID disease, or that PE has happened, so we can discontinue anticoagulation after 3 months of therapy. Again, in another place, the same BTS is saying that 1 month of therapy is perhaps also good enough. So again, BTS itself is also now in dilemma, when to stop. Okay, so 1 to 3 months is an time you decide yourself. Your own case is always your own case, and every case does not go into the guideline. So you must have a high index of suspicion for diagnosis than acute PE during this follow-up period. There should be a low threshold for investigating and treating for the VTE in patients who was doing well, but suddenly who has an acute, say, tachypnea, tachycardia, the fall of BP with a high requirement of oxygen. Patient was perhaps already on oxygen. You have discharged the patient on oxygen, and now suddenly from 2 liters he has gone to 5 to 6 liters. You must think and consider that this is a PE perhaps is happening. So you must do investigation accordingly, maybe a CTPA and a VQ scanning. But this is easy if it is a follow-up condition, but it is very difficult. I'm just touching upon in the acute case, though that's beyond the syllabus. What we are talking now is post-COVID. But I'm touching upon this because this we always face in our current management of the COVID also. Whether a patient who was suddenly doing actually okay, so 4 liters or 5 liters of oxygen suddenly has become so dyspneic, you have to take the patient to ICU and perhaps maybe you have to put it on CPAP or maybe intubate. What to do? Do you think the patient is already on steroids, a good dose of steroids, or what next? You understand that with this much of high oxygen therapy and all our COVID treatment areas are now basically some kind of a stopgap thing. So take those patients from those areas to a radiology to do a CT scan for is definitely difficult. So you must consider a presumptive diagnosis and treatment for this. Even if you can do an echo, bedside echo, But again, the COVID itself can have a right ventricular dysfunction. So unless there is a severe right ventricular dysfunction, or there is definitely you can see in the echo that there is a pulmonary embolism hanging in front of your eyes in the echo. Obviously, you are good enough to give therapy, but otherwise, I will be having my antennas up for presumptive diagnosis and treatment. You take off your Hasbled score, and where you know that where is the increased chance of bleeding. So if your Hasbled score is less, I would be very much prone to start therapy. And that will be something like a presumptive treatment for PE. So this we have to consider and think of. So this is the point I'm trying to harp again and again, that you must have a high index of suspicion for the diagnosis of acute PE during the follow-up period and also during the acute management period also. In those with PE who remain symptomatic, echo and pulmonary vascular imaging modalities such as VQ scan and CTPA is the mainstay of assessment. And VQ scanning again has got some limitations for patients with a structural lung disease, which may be more likely in the post mechanical ventilation scenarios. So next, I must talk about D-dimer and in the post-COVID scenario. Dr. Yuvraj has touched upon it a bit. A study has observed that high D-dimer level with a median of about more than 2000 versus 500 or 600, which is the standard cutoff in non-survivors compared with survivors. So non-survivors have a higher D-dimer of more than 2000 microgram. And BTS also has got now current guideline which is coming out, which says the D-dimer, according to the D-dimer level and also the patient severity, you must choose what kind of heparin or Flexen you are going to give. Less than 1000, give 40 microgram once daily of Flexen. Between 1000 to 3000, give 40 milligram twice daily. And if it is more than 3000, then give 60 twice daily. This is how now BTS guideline is suggested. So not only it does not depend only on D-dimer, again and again, it depends on the patient severity, patients, what kind of patients you are treating. Accordingly, you have to decide. So D-dimer will definitely help as a pointer that a patient whose initial D-dimer more than 2000 can be a non-survivor. It is, however, it is not possible to identify a threshold which can be used to say that this is the cutoff for non-invasive diagnosis of a thrombus and a decision to whether to give diagnostic imaging is necessary or not necessary. We cannot have that kind of cutoff yet, or might not never will happen. Acute thrombus can be excluded, however, in patients with a normal D-dimer level who do not have a high clinical probability of VT. This is common and this is known to all of us. But again, just to remind us, there is no role for routine measurement of D-dimer in post-discharge follow-up. Perhaps there is a role in when there is an acute condition. D-dimer may be useful in the investigation of possible acute PE in patients who develop acute new or worsening breathlessness, which I was talking of. It should not be used to exclude suspected chronic thromboembolic disease and PH. There is another very interesting study which has come up, and Dr. Yuvraj talked up about this. A higher level of D-dimer on admission could effectively predict impaired DLC after 3 months of discharge. So what are the other issues other than lung which we should keep our antennas up? Identify the ongoing oxygen requirement, management of dysfunctional breathing, and mental health issues. Renal dysfunction is common, and acute cardiac presentation. This is very, very common. We have seen many cases of myocarditis, even sudden cardiac death, and this myocarditis can present in the form of rhythm disturbance. We have got many of those rhythm disturbance cases, and also there will be heart failure cases. So these are the things you must also identify and follow. Nutritional need, the patient will be, those severely ill patients will lose lots of kgs and they were on ventilators, so their nutrition need to be assessed. Identifying the pulmonary rehab. This is a very important topic again, as I talked previously. the pulmonary rehab. I will touch upon pulmonary rehab later on. There will be also need to find out the cognitive, psychiatric, and physical complications, including this critical care neuromyopathy, post-acute care, which collectively called as post-intensive care syndrome, and they can take help of the post-ICU dedicated clinic, which are now coming up in all Western countries. We must also think of something like that. Then the other point is the secondary infections. We should have a high index of suspicion for bacterial and fungal co-infections. Um, Dr. Juboraj beautifully shown a case of bacterial co-infection. Um, Careful microbiological sampling, bronchoscopy, and analysis or sputum analysis are required to ensure that the infective complications are addressed as early as possible. I just want to remind you that it is not only bacterial, the fungal co-infection is also very important. Disseminated the previous SARS outbreak, studies have suggested that including disseminated invasive aspergillosis infection and CMV infections are having a high prevalence of about 15%. Possibly the systemic corticosteroids come into effect for this. In critically in patients with COVID-19, the prevalence of invasive aspergillosis is as high as 25% in some post-mortem cohorts in Western countries. So keep in mind also that fungus can also be a cause of your bacterial other secondary infections. So the pulmonary rehab. Pulmonary rehabilitation is already established as a key management strategy in those with the chronic respiratory diseases, so like COPD mostly, ILD, and obviously pre-transplant and post-transplant cases. These are very important pulmonary rehab. And these are designed to optimize patients' exercise capacity, breathlessness, health status, and psychological well-being. A study investigating the pulmonary function and exercise capacity in a group of SARS survivors showed that although the residual mild pulmonary function defects are detected in about half of the recovered patients at 3 months after discharge, but 41% had impaired exercise capacity that could not be accounted for by this only ventilatory limitation. So there is something else, and that thing else is the critical illness, muscle weakness, myopathies, and the deconditioning. These are the very common and the most common likely contributing factor which need to be addressed to, and pulmonary rehab is the only way to go about that. So pulmonary rehab is an exercise and education program designed for people with lung disease who experience symptoms of breathlessness. It is characterized by an individually prescribed and progressive exercise training program and an educational package also. It is not only exercise and training program, it is an educational package also that helps people to better understand their condition and symptoms to support effective self-management. How does it go about that? Rehabilitation course usually typically lasts for 6 to 8 weeks, at least 6 weeks, with 2 sessions at a hospital or at the rehab clinic of around 2 hours each week, and includes an individually prescribed exercise and education program, including an aerobic exercise or resistance training. Resistance training is sometimes omitted for the patients who are having cardiac abnormality, unless it is a stable cardiac disease. We continue in a stable cardiac disease, the resistance training also. But if there is some kind of instability in the cardiac disease, we do only the aerobic exercises, and obviously the lifestyle support. So this is how the exercise is being done. It is continued and complemented by the patient by carrying out of further sessions in their home environment with the aim of achieving at least 30 minutes of exercise, at least once daily, once weekly. After that, within those week at home. But the target is always the other 5 days a week, every day, 30 minutes of exercise at home. Pulmonary rehab is done for lung causes if there is a MRC dyspnea score is 3 or more, for 2 with some functional dysfunction or limitation, then it is indicated. It is usually done and delivered in a group of 8 to 16 people. And the team compromises of trained healthcare personnel such as physiotherapists, nurses, and occupational therapists. Modified approach, significant unstable cardiac or other disease that would make pulmonary rehab exercise unsafe. They should not go for pulmonary rehab. Those cardiac diseases are who have a recent AMI within 3 months of AMI, or hypertension, uncontrolled hypertension, or a patient who is having abdominal aortic aneurysm size of more than 5.5 centimeter. These people are not to be undergone pulmonary rehab. If at all, then it will be only some kind of a walking kind of a training only. Aerobic exercises only for them. People who are unable to walk or walk safely and independently and is significantly impaired due to non-respiratory conditions like severe locomotor abnormality, arthritis are to be excluded again. But we should not exclude the patients who have general musculoskeletal abnormality. Because of that only they have come to the pulmonary rehab. There the exercise is recommended. These patients may benefit from a modified pulmonary rehab by sitting exercises. They need not to walk on the treadmill. Also, people who are unable to participate in a group environment, or for whom those who are having mental issues, cognitive or personality disorders, or some kind of a communication barrier, these people are also cannot work in a group. So there you have to have a individualistic approach. What are the equipments necessary? Pulse oximeter, BP, weight scales, height charts, stopwatches for assessment and the exercise sessions, weight and resistance equipment, music player obviously, and then measuring the walking distances, 10-meter tape and 30-meter tape, chair, telephone, emergency equipment like oxygen, nebulizers, patients, aspirin, adrenaline, GTN, and defib, laptops, projectors, all those supplementary needs by which you can do some educational sessions, and appropriate aerobic exercise equipments will be the other needs. So what will be the exercises? Before you start the exercises, we will be having a goal setting. All who have a written prescription of endurance and strength exercise training at the highest tolerated exercise capacity, which should be above 60% of the peak performance by VO2, and maximum is up to 85% of the individual's maximum exercise capacity. And it should be incremental progression. The aerobic exercises is working on treadmill is the most common one, but cycling and other aerobic machines like standing and walking on the machines are also available, where you will be having simultaneously the arms and legs are working. This will be again two types, either an interval one intermittently or a continuously for about 30 minutes. It can be supervised those 2 days in the facility and unsupervised at home for the next at least those 1 day or 5 days education can do. Intensity of the aerobic exercises wherever possible, this we discussed, prescribed at the highest maximum level, and it has to be monitored, progressed. Frequency, twice weekly supervised, as I said, and as a minimum, and another additional home exercise session per week. The goal is obviously 5 sessions at home and 2 sessions at the facility. Duration, initially aiming for 20 to 30 minutes of continuous exercise in each session, then increase the intensity once achieved. This may be comprised of 2 or more bouts of short time period until the patient is able to achieve their desired 20 to 30 minutes of continuous aerobic exercise. The essential minimal time is 6 weeks, but there is obviously no maximum for duration. Strength and resistance training will be there for both upper and lower limbs. Core exercise can also be included. But very importantly, we always add supplemental oxygen during the pulmonary rehab to those who fulfill the need and the after assessment criteria for long-term or ambulatory oxygen. And we have to increase oxygen, but our target is the patient has to exercise as per his goal. if the patient is stable at 2 liters in a condition, in a chair-bound condition, but if you have to exercise, obviously it will increase his oxygen. So increase even up to 10 liters or 12 liters to help the patient to do that exercise, but those muscles has to move. The educational sessions, the discussions will be, and there will be video projections also with what is the normal respiratory physiology and mechanics in a very simple term for the patients to understand. Understand mainly the COPD and the chronic respiratory diseases like ILD, their pathophysiology, cause and treatment, the importance of exercise, relaxation techniques, stress management, how do you manage the medicines for the exacerbations, psychological impacts, the role of family and the caregivers, how to manage the breathlessness, breathing control, chest clearance, very important for bronchiectatic patients, positioning, pacing and energy conservations, smoking cessation services if needed, very, very important. And we talk not only about the activities of physical activities, we talk about the nutrition supplements, lifestyle changes, all those things will be mainly talked about. So how do you do the outcome measurements? Outcome measurement are done in 3 different ways. The improvement in walking distance, the maximal and the endurance walking using either the 6-minute walk test or the incremental shuttle walk distance. So I and the places I got trained, we prefer the 6-minute walk distance, and we see how much is the oxygen usage previously and now during the exercise. Whether it was not there or increased, how much the desaturation happened even with oxygen, how much previously, how much after exercise, and at that 6-minute walk distance. So this is how we form our opinion whether the intervention has worked or not. Improvement in the health-related quality of life questionnaires is another format. And then we see the functional status, including the validated measures, those like CPET, cardiopulmonary exercise testing, peak exercise intensity, peak oxygen consumption, peak minute volume, peak minute ventilation, and the lactate threshold, etc. we measured. Also, we see the reduction in anxiety, depressions, and knowledge and understanding of the condition. These are all validated questionnaires are there. Patient will be asked to fill up both before and after the pulmonary rehab techniques. So that is it. Thank you. Questions, comments, suggestions? Hello. Sir, we cannot hear you, Dr. Piketty.
Sir,
Yeah, now it's fine.
Thank you, Dr. Roy, for this wonderful presentation. I think it's so important for us not only to look at disease, but also to look at post-disease and to look at all aspects of post-disease, medical, emotional, look at depression, look at a lot of things. And how do you evaluate the disease over a period of time? I think your stress on the exercise testing, especially the 6-minute walk, I think is a wonderful test. The one thing that I will not depend upon is to depend upon a spirometry for these patients. Not only because it's extremely difficult to do a good spirometry, because I think it's got absolutely no connection with the sort of dynamic systemic disease of COVID that we have here today.
Yes,
so
sir.
I would think that the sort of dynamic indices are any day better than the others. I have a couple of questions here. Vinod, can you take those questions, Vinod, please?
Yeah, I think I'll first put the question to Yuvraj because some of them are on pirfenidone and nintedanib.
Yes,
I think you are interested in that. So
Yes,
one
sir.
question was, what is the dose of pirfenidone to be used? And the other question was, which one is better in your opinion, pirfenidone or nintedanib? Yeah.
Sir, actually, as I initially pointed out that, only particular group of patient only needs is antifibrotics. Like this presentation, other people should not take that all the post-COVID pneumonia that, as sir was telling that in a point that they was telling that all the patients, still there is a controversial issue when we should start the therapy, when we should start antifibrotics, which group of patients we should start antifibrotics, whether we should depend only on seeing the CT findings or clinical picture, or whether those patients who are having a severe pneumonia and after discharge, they're having persistent desaturation, whether we have to, nobody know what is the exact, group of patients where we should start antifibrotics. According to me, what is my personal experience, I'm telling you, sir. So as per the clinical registry, which was registered for all the antifibrotics till now, some are in phase 3, some are in phase 2. These registry, they have used pirfenidone, they have used nintedanib, they are still in phase 2 and phase 3. Many of the trials, they have used pirfenidone in the clinical course less than 14 days. The point is less than 14 days. Even many of us would not agree that same thing. Even I'm also not in favor of giving the pirfenidone or nintedanib at the time of acute COVID pneumonia when the patient sits in our ICU or ward. But there is some logic based on their previous experience as with the SARS and MERS and all. There is some logic. They are telling that fibrosis starts at the end of 1 week, becomes maximum at 3rd week. So according to me, so we should wait for the normal healing to occur, because this fibrosis is like nothing but aberrant healing. I told you, this aberrant healing may not be there for all the patients, and we should really need some biomarkers. We should really need some other tests to guide us which group of patients really benefit from this antifibrotics in order to save the money for the patient, in order to avoid unnecessary adverse effects in the acute phase of disease while we just manage the patient. According to me, which group of patients I'm selecting, I'll tell you, sir. One is those patients who got a severe COVID pneumonia, having a protracted course in ICU, who got a long, course with a longer requirement of oxygen, longer requirement of CPAP or any positive pressure therapy, who got an additional stress for the lung. So, and at the end, time of discharge, those patients who got a CT, who got still a bad disease, got almost more than 80% of lung involved, having evidence of crazy paving pattern along with gross septal thickening and all. So we may not be seeing a traction bronchiectasis in all the cases. Maybe that's a good idea that we see the traction bronchitis and all. We not be seeing all traction in all the cases. What is my point is that there is a worsening of the lung function after an episode of COVID pneumonia. These patients require oxygen for long duration. As you know, the nintedanib for other fibrotic ILD, so it has achieved a short-term benefit, sir, based on the various studies. Even after 2 weeks also, if you do all the different pulmonary functions, after two months and 3 months, they got a good positive result in nintedanib. That's a positive point, because pirfenidone has not got that good result. So what is my view is that those patients who got a severe COVID pneumonia, those patients who got an interstitial or intervalvular septal thickening, those patients who got a protracted course in ICU, these patients would be benefited from antifibrotics. The dose what I use is that I prefer nintedanib over pirfenidone, just because a simple reason is that this is actually nintedanib is as only 2 drugs we have to take. Only like pill burden is so less. Even though if we are telling that pirfenidone, it is coming at around 800 milligram and different doses. I could assess from the patient that the size of the tablet matters a lot. You know, the pirfenidone, the tablet size is very large. Many patients are complaining that, sir, after taking the tablet, I could not take any other medicines. So maybe nintedanib adjusts over pirfenidone. So one problem in the nintedanib I face is some people I face diarrhea, but diarrhea is not a major side, adverse effect that limits us to use nintedanib. But theoretical complications like bleeding and cardiovascular complications, like what we discussed, COVID and pneumonia, that is there with nintedanib also. But nintedanib dose is 150 milligram BD, sir. Pirfenidone dose, what I use initially is starting from as like IPF, 1 tablet TDS initially. I will see how they tolerate, because we use all other drugs, steroids and all these things. Then after 1 week, I will slowly increase the drug dose of the drug, not at the dose as we use in IPF. I have not used any patient the same dose, like more than 1,100, more than 2,000 milligram. I've used a simple dose, 222, 111 for first week and 222 for next subsequent weeks. And I follow just maybe for 6 weeks, and I'm not very sure that how long we have to give this therapy. Like it depends upon the personalized experience based on the different patients.
Thank you. Actually, I would like to congratulate both of you for making this a very, very excellent presentation. The next question I'll put it to Sinha, sir. Actually, one thing I would like to thank you, sir, for pointing out that it is not only a pulmonary disease, both of you, in fact, and it's more of a systemic illness. There is hyperglycemia. There are a lot of infections post-COVID. There are vascular complications. So it's a multi-system problem. And like sir told, even anxiety disorders, it is not confined to the respiratory medicine alone. So there are a couple of questions, other questions. Sinha sir, one question which the audience want to know is there a role of inhalers in post-COVID scenario? And how long do you use steroids in these patients? And
What was the first question, sir? What is the
what
role of
inhalers? Is there a role for inhalation therapy? Meter dose
inhalation,
inhalers and
inhalation therapy? Yeah.
inhalation therapy, yeah.
Uh, Again, everything is, I would say, here and say. There is still, we do not have any concrete proof of anything. Yes, there were at the very beginning of COVID, there was a few, not only few, I would say only one or two incidences which came to our light that the perhaps budesonide inhaled could have helped. That may be anecdotal, I don't know. But steroids as such, as an injectable therapy or an oral therapy, has got a mortality benefit. This is the only drug which we know that has got a mortality benefit, and that is accepted by a very wide studies all over on different studies. So the question is how to use it and how long to use it. That is a very valid question. Again, the answer would be uh, what I do is in the acute stage, on the moderate to severe patients who needs oxygen, they should get oral steroids. I still continue with, as per Oxford studies, dexamethasone is a choice for me, though there are many people who think the methylprednisolone having a better lung penetration perhaps work. But then again, if we choose methylprednisolone, maybe we are going out of the study purview or study permits. And that was the Oxford study. So I really don't know. I stick to dexamethasone. Injection 6 milligram, exactly as the study has said and done. And I give for 10 days, if possible to give. Means possible to give means if there is no secondary bacterial infections and the WBC count is going haywire. I really don't know whether that count is because of the steroid itself or a secondary bacterial infection. I think that that is more of a bacterial infection in a middle-aged or late patient with a diabetes going haywire with steroids. I stop steroid and try to treat bacterial infections till the culture comes back. So this is how I try to treat. And at the end of the infection, when the WBC count comes down, I try to restart the steroid to have at least 10 days of steroid therapy. During the acute phase, on discharge, who will be giving steroid? As I said, as I have said, those who are having cough features, the ground glassing, extensive ground glassing, and sending the patient on oxygen to home. I will continue this oral steroid. In this case, yes, dexamethasone is a choice, or I choose sometimes methylprednisolone, either of that as home therapy. How long to give? I try to stop it as soon as I can stop the oxygen, and unless there is any secondary infections. This is how I go about it. Perhaps my thinking is a month, that I take it as a month of steroid therapy post-COVID period. That's how I do it. I don't know whether I'm right, wrong. Someday it will prove us what is correct or not. But this is how currently I do it.
Dr. Roy, can I ask both of you one question?
Yes, sir.
There is a certain city in India, and I will not name the city, who's swearing by cyclosinide inhale in patients post-COVID as such, post-steroid, post-COVID, post-COVID fibrosis, whatever. And you know what city I'm talking about. But I just want to know your take on these two things, because there are a lot of people who started trying to use this as such. What is it like? Is it only experimental, or is it a sort of individual perception that people have that drug like cyclosinide will help? What is it like?
So my thinking is it's a good clinical science or good clinical judgment. It's not that whimsical. I would say that because cyclosinide is a very good steroid, and as we know that steroid is indicated, see the bad effects of oral steroids. There will be our diabetes will become haywire, our bone fragility, which patients was already on prolonged therapy at ICU, and then at 70 or 70 plus years, the bones will be in a very bad conditions, and their psychosocially, psychological involvement also with oral steroids. So those are the side effects. So why not cut it out, give cyclophosphamide once daily therapy, good enough. I agree with that. But what goes against that? That it is still, as if you see at that those severely ill patients, if you see their D dimer or maybe IL-6, even at discharge, there will be still their high. That means the inflammation is still continuing. So maybe an oral steroid at a low dose could have been helpful for this patient. As we continue to say, sir, we really don't know what is going to work. Till now, we thought keep remdesivir works. Very recently, we have come to know that WHO says bullshit.
Very
Sir,
recently, we've come to know that nothing works
Nothing
except
works.
to go down on your knees and pray, possibly. And I think even that, if you don't do it well enough, you are in the soup. I think I just have one question for you, Raj. These patients who are at home, who are home quarantined as such, do you
Yes, sir.
think there is a role for one, steroids, two, antivirals, three, what is it you want to give them? Do you just want to watch their saturation, or you want to leave them alone? Take only SOS paracetamol? What is it you want to do?
Sir, here I am very clear, and I am on solid clinical ground here. Nothing. Do not give
Okay,
steroid as per
excellent.
Oxford. Do not give steroid unless there is a need for oxygen. This is proved. This is
Okay.
proven enough.
Yuvraj, yes?
Sir, sir, what is the thing in acute phase? What I am following is that thing. You have to just closely watch for the complications, sir. Not all the patients with viral pneumonia worsens. So that group of patient you need to pick up. That's very important. Before making them a home isolation, you should have a protocol to adequately follow up them. So maybe there are certain risk factors we have framed in our institute. So that patients actually we never allowed for follow up. We never allowed for home quarantine or home isolation. That patient we insist for admission. Those patients who are having chronic respiratory disease, those patients who are already having a CAD or CKD, those patients already on immunosuppressives, and those patients who got a CT and that CT showed any evidence of severe form of involvement, form of crazy paving and all the all the other signs. So these patients actually we insist them for admission, sir.
No,
This is for acute COVID pneumonia, I'm telling.
no, Yuvraj,
Because
one second.
yes, sir.
Dr. Piketty's question is very specific. You have done all
Ah,
those. You
ah,
have done your exclusion criteria who need to be admitted, and then
okay,
decided that this patient needs to be treated at home.
okay.
Those
So
cases
my
are good.
question is, do you use steroids at home, for
In this
example?
kind.
No,
Do you
sir.
use antivirals at home, for
No,
example?
again.
Or you just close your hands, keep quiet, and as I said, pray hard and give them some paracetamol? What is it you do?
Sir,
Same thing, sir.
slightly
Like
more.
same thing, acid or nothing, I will give, sir.
No,
Only
Okay,
those patients,
great.
yes, sir.
no, I
I
give.
think this is important because, like lot of our colleagues are treating lot of patients at home, and we need to know what to give and what not to give. Whether there is a role for antivirals because they call it the viral replication phase or whatever. Whether there is a role for antivirals at all or not, and I think that is the reason why I asked you this question. And as you very rightly said, it's too early to comment about cyclisinide. Let's not say that it's good or bad, but then let's just wait and see what happens as such. The
One more
others,
thing.
what? Yeah,
One more
tell
thing,
me.
sir. In this kind of patients, actually, sir, I give doxycycline.
Okay,
Reason is one, it does not cause any harm. That much
correct.
I'm very sure.
Agreed.
It might help. I don't know. Someday after 5 years, maybe I will come to know it might have helped. From Bangladesh, it had come. Maybe it will help with. So don't know. But it is causing no harm. And maybe if my diagnosis is wrong, if it was not COVID, if it was something else, atypical things, doxy will work.
Fine.
That's how. And also, patient will need something more than paracetamol. How come you
Okay.
say just you pray, go home and pray? So doxycycline and paracetamol.
No. That was just a statement that I made as such. The other thing I wanted to know was about what of these patients do you really put on anticoagulation long term, and what is your choice of anticoagulation?
Sir,
Is
this
it
I
a
discussed.
continuation? 1 minute, let me finish, please. Is it a continuation of the anticoagulation that you give in hospital when they are in the ICU on the ventilator? And what do you prefer? Do you prefer the older anticoagulants, or you prefer drugs like rivaroxaban or dabigatran or things like that? what is your choice of preference, or is age a matter there in preferring one of these two drugs?
Okay, so at hospital, as I have shown in my slides, those people who are seriously ill and D-dimer is an indicator which kind of dose you will be giving. For that, less than 1,000 to 3,000, less than 1,000 low dose, 1,000 to 3,000 moderate dose, and more than 3,000 high dose. So this is as per BTS guideline. Very well settled. At discharge, at discharge, whom will you give? Again, I have a pointer who really needs to be given. Those who were very seriously ill in ICU, on ventilator, on CPAP, very high FiO2 need. Those patient is one of my patients whom I will pick and choose. Second will be obese person. Third, a person who has a background SLE. Fourth, maybe a past history of DVT sometime. These kind of patients I will definitely choose along with this continuous, severe disease, not only one of them, just like this. Along with the severe disease, I will choose those patients to receive at home oral anticoagulants. Which one? Again, I would prefer to choose any elderly patients more than 75. That's, I take it as an arbitrary cutoff. I take those patients for a max. And somewhere else, if the cost is not a factor, definitely again NOACs. If the cost is a factor, then our oral acetylcholine. That's how I go about it.
Do you have any other questions? Otherwise, I have one question for you, Raj. You finish first.
Yeah, there was a question about vaccination.
Exactly.
Do you recommend pneumococcal and influenza vaccination post-COVID? This is the last question from the audience.
Definitely, sir. Definitely,
Yes, sir.
both of them are needed.
I think
And the guideline is very correct, and it is established. The same guideline of adult vaccination should be followed.
Same thing, sir. Already they got a damage. We got a COVID pneumonia, so it's definitely like they should be prevented from all the annual this flu and this serious pneumonia and all. Definitely a logic to give both pneumococcal and flu vaccinations.
Okay. Dr. Yura, just one thing struck me when you showed me those two CTs.
Yes, sir.
My first impression was, oh my God, this is a goner.
Yes. Yes, sir.
That was my first impression. Like at the back of my mind, I was saying, oh my God, something's really
Yes.
wrong with these guys. These guys come out. This is what I'm saying. There is no connect between radiological features and sometimes even your so-called viral markers like D-dimer, for example. I have
True,
had
sir.
patients with 2000 D-dimer. My first patient, when I think it was late January, I think, I had a patient with 2000 D-dimer. And I was shot, my hands were shaking. I didn't know what to do. So I called my friend, the vascular surgeon, and then he said, oh my God, my hands are shaking too. What shall I do? He said, okay, you give her low molecular weight heparin. So that's what I did. I gave her enoxaparin for 4 or 5 days and repeated it was down 600. I've done this in about 5, 6 people. And they've had no evidence of disease. All of them have been young, between 20 and 40 years without any pre-existing disease whatsoever. So my question really is that, is there some tipping point other than our clinical and our thing, that what do you think is the tipping point that tips these people off into a sort of whatever cytokine storm? Today there are people disputing the cytokine storm even for that matter, but I think that's a discussion for another day. What tips them into getting into a serious condition with this as such? Is there any marker which will tell you upfront itself, my patient is going to be bad, my patient is not going to be bad? Or you think such a thing doesn't exist?
Yes, sir. As you rightly pointed out that we need good biomarkers, both in acute phase and both also in a post-COVID phase. But as you rightly pointed out that I have also experienced the same situation. The patient have enormous D-dimer, completely stable patients.
Exactly.
Based on the various clinical reports, sir, all the complications, post-COVID complications had higher D-dimer value. When you retrospectively think that whether it will be reflected for all the patients, I don't know whether it is real or not. I have just went ahead in doing a CTPA for some of the patients to see Because
Right.
even though I counsel the patient, even though you are not having dyspnea or not having anything, I just checked most of the patients, and even 2 or 3 times also they did. They of their own. Even though I told them not to do, they did a doctor shopping, and they did a 2 CTPA in the matter of 1.5 months. I have seen those patients who got a higher D-dimer value at the time of admission or at the time of diagnosis, but I could not find any evidence of embolus, at least even the segmental arteries also. So that clearly proves that not even a single biomarker can clearly 100% guide you that these patients are going to get a serious disease, or this patient going to get a good amount of fibrosis after a follow-up. So that's the thing, sir. That's what actually
Okay.
I also see. And same thing, sir, even with the CT, I have discussed with my radiology friends, like, what do you feel? So many people have given a severity scoring, different patterns of scoring patterns are being given. And other people, other physicians who are not pulmonologists, they are very much afraid on seeing the score, on seeing the value. Even that at the time of discharge, if they
Correct.
got a score of 15 plus or 20 plus, they come with a score and then they're asking us what to do, whether I have to continue the steroids, whether I have to give high dose of steroid. They might have taken. So the point was, we have studied all the cases, and what we found out is that the CT pattern, the CT scoring is not actually directly correlating with the severity of clinical illness.
Correct.
I'm telling
I
number of
agree with
lobes, sir. Number of
100%.
lobes. Maybe, sir, maybe what I discussed with my radiology friends, that if they tell the CT pattern instead of scoring, so they have to include the pattern. There are certain patterns in the CT which shows the severity of disease. One pattern is a crazy pavement pattern. That's what I told you, sir. As we know that crazy pavement pattern is the interstitial fibrosis in the background of ground glassing. The background. That means that fibrosis already started. In addition to that, there is active inflammation is there. What we see as a ground glass, what we see as acute phase of disease, that is there. That means that repeated inflammation is going on in that same patient with a fibrosis. What they're telling, crazy paving pattern, if you are seeing in some CTs, that shows that they might have got a good amount of very bad disease in that group of patient. And what they are telling is that any COVID patient who got a pleural effusion, where that pleural effusion is not attributed to any other causes other than they were COVID pneumonia, that patient also got a severe disease. So with the radiology patterns, it's very difficult, and there is not even a single biomarker which can predict. Even though there are a lot of studies are there, 100% we cannot, we are not very sure. So we are seeing that lymphocytopenia and all these things and all. Lymphocytopenia maybe is there for long duration for many viral pneumonias. Many viral pneumonias. Just with the lymphocytopenia and that's with the NL ratio and all, we can't clearly predict. So only thing what we are so much afraid, as you are telling, sir, this D-dimer, why we are giving this anticoagulant, because we don't want to lose not even a single patient. As anecdotal reports shows that it has more amount of complications, we don't want to lose them. That's why, sir, that we are giving. But I have checked this patient with CTPA. None of this patient, like stable patient who got a D-dimer only higher, but not having a severe disease, both clinically and radiologically also, as basically, because many people will consider the score as a severity. In that group of patients also, no embolism was seen. So this is my personal view, sir.
Dr. Roy, do you think the scoring is good, bad, ugly? What is it?
Sir, I also have the same opinion about that scoring. I usually go by how much is the lung involvement, how much percentage of the lung involvement. That I think is a better way for
index.
me, rather than the severity index they give. That is not, that does not tally with the patient's actual clinical status. That's very important. Again, sir, you asked first, and what are the parameters you will be feeling afraid of when those are present in a patient? Yes, I will be afraid if that is an elderly patient, and I will be afraid if they are having associated diabetes. These are the two things with some more than 30% or 40% of lung involvement, percentage of the lung involvement. I'm not talking about the scores. I will be very afraid for these people. And I will try to give whatever I have heard, anecdotal or what, all those drugs, and hope and pray that they will come out.
Sir, even the same personal experience, like what sir told, sir, those patients who got a diabetes mellitus, who are poorly controlled, not controlled with adequately with insulin or like that. So if you got a HbA1c more than 8, actually indirectly what we see is that these patients are worsening. clinically. I'm telling roughly around 75% of them, 60 to 75% are having worsening of the disease, both clinically and radiologically.
The problem with the scoring, I think, is that the scoring is on paper and the patients read the scoring. That is the whole problem.
That is the problem.
The scoring has now become like a blood sugar.
Yes, sir.
No, my blood sugar is 400 versus your blood sugar is 100. You know, like that. That's what it's become. And I think it's not as simple as that. And I think I don't know. I would be very skeptical about scoring, and I would think that scoring does no good at all, except for people who you cannot see the CT at all because the patient is very far away and you need to act on something. They'd rather, as very rightly said, describe patterns rather than putting up scores as such. Dr. Roy, one last question, and I think what was obviously missing from your presentation was, is there a low role for lung transplant today, tomorrow, day after?
Yeah, definitely. That we have not discussed at the time because it is still far away, I think.
Okay.
I know there are many lung transplants happening currently, but are we really at that stage? So take up the other diseases. Don't take the post-COVID scenarios. Take COPD. Lung transplant is perhaps the very late stage we do.
Exactly.
ILD, again, we wait long. Though we refer to a lung transplant center, is supposed to refer actually as soon as you diagnose the case. But again, when we do, only when there is a significant patient deterioration is there. Again, it should not be done very late stage. That is very important. And it should not be done too early also. Is 1 month post-COVID, is it really conditioned for lung transplant? Perhaps in a very few subset of patients who are already on ECMO and with a very bad lung condition, perhaps they are really qualifies for lung transplant. But most of the patients, perhaps it is too early to talk about lung transplant. Most of them will slowly recover in 3 months' time. Most of them. That's what my personal view is.
Yeah, I think that's good in the sense that you use ECMO or you use supportive dynamic supportive therapy as an indication for the fact that you have a long term with that. So there's nothing more to do other than try and see whether transplant works at all or not. I think that would be a nice, sensible way of dealing with these things. I think you've cleared up a lot of my doubts and a lot of my my ignorance has vanished. At least I hope it's vanished.
Sir, I cannot clear up your doubt. You usually clear up our doubts.
No, but it's been very nice actually, to talk to people who've been involved in this. Like it's a great experience, and I think all of us learn from that. Every single person learns. You learn, I learn, people who are listening learns, and I think it's a terrific learning experience. And also it is a disease where we learn every single day. We go back and forth. Yesterday I saw some guideline from somewhere. Somebody had sent it to me from WhatsApp. That's the question that I began with. Nothing works. Absolutely nothing works. You give steroids, you give oxygen, you give low molecular weight heparin, and then you sit down and pray. That's all. There's nothing else that works.
True.
If you look at that guideline, it's beautifully done. There are wonderful pictorial diagrams in that. I don't know where it came from. I didn't even have the patience to go and look through it. But then it's wonderfully done. But what bottom line is, nothing works. Nothing works. Absolutely nothing works. And what works? I don't know.
Add in that plasma also, sir. Nothing.
Exactly.
Plasma therapy.
Correct. Correct. I know. Correct. Vinod, you have anything else to say?
No, sir. We are waiting for your concluding remarks.
Oh my God. No, before that, I think Cipla has a 1 minute, 2 minute video for us, which is based on some community education in patients with airways diseases. And I think we'll give Cipla those 2 minutes, let them finish the playing of that, and then we'll wind up. But Rahul, it's all yours. Nobody around? Hello.
Yes,
Yeah.
ஆஸ்துமா இந்த வார்த்தையை உங்க டாக்டர் சொன்னதுமே உங்க வாழ்க்கை நின்று போன மாதிரி தோணியிருக்கும். யோசிச்சிருப்பீங்க, ஆஸ்துமா இருந்தா கனவு எப்படி நனவாகும்னு. இந்த ஆஸ்துமா கூட நாம எப்படி வாழ்றது, ஆனா ஒரு வழி இருக்கு. அது மூலமா உங்க எல்லா கனவுமே நனவாகும். அப்புறம் ஆஸ்துமாவையும் உங்களால தோற்கடிக்க முடியும். தடையில்லா வாழ்க்கைக்கு வழி இதுல தான் இருக்கு. ஆஸ்துமாவிற்கு இன்ஹேலர் தான் சரி. எனக்கு தெரியும், இன்ஹேலர் பேரை கேட்டாலே பயமா இருக்கும். உங்க நண்பர், சித்தி, டீச்சர் சொல்றத வச்சு இது ஒரு இயலாமையோட சின்னம்னு நினைப்பீங்க. இதெல்லாம் கேட்டு பயப்படாதீங்க. அவங்களுக்கு என்ன தெரியும்? டாக்டர்களும் இதுதான் பாதுகாப்பான சிறந்த வழின்னு சொல்றாங்க. ஆஸ்துமாவிற்கு இன்ஹேலர் தான் சரி. இந்த ஆஸ்துமாவை பத்தி எனக்கு அவ்வளவா தெரியாது. அதனால நான் சொல்றத உடனே நீங்க ஏன் நம்பணும்? சரி வாங்க, நான் ஒரு 3 பேரை பத்தின கதையை சொல்றேன். இந்த 3 பேரும் உலகத்தையே ஜெயிச்சிருக்காங்க, ஆஸ்துமாவையும் ஜெயிச்சிருக்காங்க. இவங்க நம்பினது ஆஸ்துமாவிற்கு இன்ஹேலர் தான் சரி. உங்களுக்கு ஆஸ்துமா இருக்கு, உங்களால இது முடியுமான்னு எல்லாரும் கேட்டாங்க. மக்களை சிரிக்க வைக்கிறது ஒன்றும் சாதாரண விஷயம் இல்லை. ஆஸ்துமா தாக்கினா நீங்க மேடையிலே விழுந்துருவீங்க. ஜோக் சொல்றதுக்கு பதிலா நீங்களே ஜோக்கா மாறிடுவீங்க. நீங்க ஆஸ்துமாவா உங்க இன்ஹேலரால தோற்கடிச்சீங்க. எல்லாரையும் சிரிக்க வச்சு இந்தியாவோட காமெடி குயினா மாறினீங்க. அதுக்கு காரணம் என்னன்னா, ஆஸ்துமாவிற்கு இன்ஹேலர் தான் சரி. தம்பி, உனக்கு ஆஸ்துமா இருக்கு, உன்னால இதெல்லாம் முடியாதுன்னு சொன்னாங்க. மசாலாவோட புகையினால உனக்கு அட்டாக் வரலான்னு சொன்னாங்க. 14 மணி நேரம் ஒரே இடத்துல நிக்கணும், அவ்வளோ ஸ்டாமினா உங்ககிட்ட எங்க இருக்கு? ஆனா ஆஸ்துமாவை நீங்க தோற்கடிச்சீங்க இன்ஹேலரால. சின்ன வயசுல இருந்து கண்ட கனவெல்லாம் நீங்க நனவாக்கிட்டீங்க. மிச்லின் ஸ்டாரை ஜெயிச்சிட்டீங்க ஒரே ஒரு நம்பிக்கையோட. ஆஸ்துமாவிற்கு இன்ஹேலர் தான் சரி. ஆஸ்துமா இருக்கிறதால உன்னால எதுவும் செய்ய முடியாது. நாங்க ராப்பகலா உன்னால எப்படி உழைக்க முடியும்? மாடிப்படி ஏறும்போது கூட அட்டாக் வரலாம். ஜெயிக்கிறத விடு, பேட்மிண்டன் எப்படி விளையாடுவ? ஆனா ஆஸ்துமாவை உன்னோட இன்ஹேலரால தோற்கடிச்ச. பேட்மிண்டன் மேல மக்களுக்கு ஒரு ஈர்ப்பு உண்டாக்கின. அர்ஜுனா அவார்டு மற்றும் காமன்வெல்த் கோல்டையும் ஜெயிச்ச ஒரே ஒரு நம்பிக்கையினால. ஆஸ்துமாவிற்கு இன்ஹேலர் தான் சரி. அதனால இன்னில இருந்து இந்த கதைகளை ஞாபகம் வச்சுக்கோங்க. மத்தவங்க சொல்றதே இல்ல. உங்க கனவுகளுக்கு இறக்கை கொடுங்க. நீங்க சொல்ற ஜோக்கால மக்கள் தரையில விழுந்து சிரிக்கணும். நீங்க பண்ற சமையல்னால மக்கள் நிறுத்தாம சாப்பிடணும். நீங்க விளையாடுற விளையாட்டால எதிராளி ஓடி போயிடணும். இன்ஹேலர் உங்ககிட்ட இருந்தா ஆஸ்துமா உங்களை தடுக்க முடியாது. நீங்க விண்ணை தொட விரும்பினா இன்ஹேலர் தான் சரி. தடையில்லா வாழ்க்கை வாழ நினைச்சா இன்ஹேலர் தான் சரி. குறிக்கோள் எதுவும் தொலைவில் இல்லை. ஆஸ்துமாவை கண்டு பயப்பட தேவையில்லை. ஏன்னா ஆஸ்துமாவிற்கு
இன்ஹேலர் தான் சரி.
இன்ஹேலர் தான் சரி.
இன்ஹேலர் தான் சரி.
இன்ஹேலர் தான் சரி.
I have only one more suggestion in this to Cipla.
Please.
No, not to use it, the Cipla. Why only inhalers? Why not DPIs? Same thing we need on DPIs.
No, I think that's a different discussion altogether. A lot of us are basically leftists, I think. So I think it may be a little difficult to come to some common ground on this. So I don't think we talk about this. But I think we can have a talk another day, whether these things really help at all or not.
Sure.
It's good to have discussions about this. What sort of community education is really necessary for asthma?
Yeah.
With these types of celebrity-oriented things, will they work at all or not? They work in some people. There's nothing wrong with that at all. It does work in some people. But then, as I said, ultimately the responsibility for inhalers lies with us. Let us never forget the fact that we are responsible whether our patients take the inhaler or they don't take the inhalers. And I think that's the only thing that I can say at the bottom of this all. And I think it's been a great 1.5 hours. It's been great listening to both of you and your experience. I would really like to thank my co-chair, Dr. Vinod, who's a great friend of mine, Dr. Yuvarajan, and Dr. Roy, whom I've known for such a long time. It's been a great pleasure to be associated with you. Thank you very much for your great insights and for your great presentations. And thanks, Cipla, for all the help and for continuing with this. And I hope you continue with this, because every single day we learn. and every day is different from the previous day, and the next day will be even different from today. Extremely important for us to understand that life goes on in spite of all that comes behind us, in front of us, and on top of us. I think life is still a very lengthy journey. Thank you very much for the patient hearing. Please stay safe and God bless you all. Thank you.
Thank you, sir.
Thank you.
And the show must go on, sir. Yeah, thank you.
Thank you, sir.
Thanks, Cipla, for such a nice and wonderful facility for us to talk and discuss. Thanks. Thank you all of you. Bye.
Thank you, sir. Thank you, sir.
Thank you. Thank you, Tambi. Thanks.